Survival. Rose Elusive. Frozen Planet. Friday at 10. On Science. Question everything.
In the early 1980s, a medical disaster struck which would radically alter the way researchers looked at infectious diseases. AIDS hit America's cities.
Although our original and first detection of the AIDS illnesses was in the community of gay men, there was a second population that became infected at around the same time, but for a very different reason. And these were young boys who were born with the blood disease hemophilia.
Hemophilia is a condition where the blood can't clot properly. Sufferers live under the constant threat of fatal internal bleeding. They rely on regular injections of a clotting agent called Factor VIII. In the 80s, this put them at particular risk from HIV because Factor VIII was extracted from donated blood. And any one unit of Factor VIII could contain blood products from hundreds of donors. If just one of those people had HIV, then the entire batch was contaminated. The result was the accidental infection of a large number of hemophiliacs.
The hemophiliacs were carrying a virus that was very deadly, killing 90% of the people it infected. More deadly, if you will, than a bullet to the head.
But as with the Great Plague in London, some people who should have died didn't. Bill Jameson is one such survivor. He saw firsthand what HIV/AIDS was doing to the people around him.
It turned out that the products that we used to actually control our bleeding were actually the products that would turn out to kill most of us.
Like every hemophiliac, Jameson was faced with a terrible dilemma. Take the Factor VIII and risk dying of AIDS, or don't take it and face the possibility of bleeding to death.
What do you do? What do you do? I had a wife, I had kids, I had a business, I had responsibilities. So in order to provide for them, I decided to take that risk and continue to use that product.
Jameson assumed that he would contract HIV and die.
I would go in, they would have maybe 15 or 20 doctors just literally staring at me and scratching their heads, trying to figure out, this guy took this product, everybody else is positive, but you're as healthy as an ox. And that was the big question.
The same question intrigued Dr. O'Brien.
I wondered whether or not there was a difference in certain genes that allowed them to defend and clear the virus more efficiently than the individual who did become infected.
He soon began what some called a fishing expedition, hunting out the one mutated gene in 25,000 which would make people like Bill Jameson resistant to AIDS.
Most mutations, particularly when they occur inside of genes, are not very good for you. It's a little bit like taking a hammer to the engine of a Mercedes-Benz and just whacking something. Well, most of the time you do damage. Maybe one time in a million you might do some good and make the car run a little bit better.
It was 2 days before Thanksgiving in 1997 that I got a call from my treatment center, and they said, Bill, you know, we found out why you never became HIV positive. I said, well, okay, you know, let's find out what this big mystery is.
As it turns out, Jameson had inherited a genetic mutation. They called it Delta 32. When HIV infects a normal cell, it does so by latching onto a protein called a receptor. This receptor is the virus's doorway into the cell. In Bill Jameson's case, the Delta 32 mutation means there is no receptor and no way for HIV to enter the cell. The infection is stopped in its tracks. After years of searching, had Dr. O'Brien and his colleagues finally found what they were looking for?
When we first discovered CCR5 Delta 32, it was a whopper. It was basically the equivalent of pulling out a 300-pound marlin out of the sea on our fishing expedition because it caused complete resistance to HIV in all of the people who carried 2 copies of it, one from each parent.
They now understood what the mutation was, that you inherited it from both parents, and that it gave you immunity to HIV. But to help non-carriers, they wanted to harness the power of Delta 32. That meant understanding everything about it. Why did some people carry this mutation? Where did it come from? According to the theory of evolution, mutations are produced by mistakes in the genetic code. If they provide a positive benefit to the carrier, they survive into the next generation. So Delta 32 must have helped previous generations in some way, long before AIDS arrived on the scene.
We were looking for some sort of breathtaking, cataclysmic event that basically wiped out millions of people, but differentially, according to whether or not they carried this gene. We thought it probably was an infectious disease of some sort, like HIV, but we knew it wasn't HIV/AIDS because that disease has only been around for less than 2 generations.
The answer, again, lies in the DNA. Because if you know how to read the genetic code, it will point to the time in the past when the mutation was most vital. When carriers survived and non-carriers didn't.
The length of a segment around the Delta 32 is a surrogate, if you will, for time. So we examined that variation. We estimated the time elapsed since Delta 32 was last strongly favored. And that number came up to be 700 years, smack in the middle of the 14th century.
This is a vital piece of evidence. Delta 32 had a significant impact in the middle of the 14th century, the time when bubonic plague, the Black Death, first struck the populations of Europe.
The Black Death was probably the greatest epidemic in history. Something of the order of 25 to 30 million Europeans had died.
Dr. O'Brien began to wonder if Delta 32 carriers were better equipped to survive bubonic plague, and that was when he connected another part of the puzzle. The last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Europe was the Great Plague of 1665. A much higher proportion of people seem to have survived that epidemic than survived earlier outbreaks of the disease. Is this evidence of the Delta 32 mutation at work?
It could have been that the survivors of the Black Death passed down genes that protected their descendants from the Great Plague of the 17th century.
If Dr. O'Brien is right, Delta 32 doesn't just confer immunity to AIDS. It could be even more powerful than that.